Good evening and welcome to the channel. I am Brian Lusk. Thank you for joining me today. Glad to have you here. And you know what? I just saw this comment by Ozzy. And of course, what did I have to do but look up to see if it was true or not? And doggone it, it absolutely is. Ukraine and the Donbass region might seem a long way from Wales, but there are historical connections linking the two places. Donbass is shortening for the Donetsk coal basin, Donbass, and is a landscape rich in coal and iron ore deposits. These lands, which are always inhabited by nomadic peoples, Tatar and Nogai hordes, and Cossacks, were colonized by the Russian Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries during its expansion to the wild field in the south. Coal was discovered in 1721, after which the Russian Empire commissioned extensive surveys and studies to map the region's rich underground mineral resources. While mining took place in Donbass in the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, it wasn't until the Russian Empire revised fiscal policy and invited foreign capitalists to develop the region's coal and steelmaking industries that coal mining began to dominate local economies. But then we can go back a little bit farther down here. The history of Husovka, as has been told, of these brave Welsh pioneers who ventured to the barren East Steppe to develop mining industries there and make their fortunes. And reading the archival letters and postcards held at the Husovka Research Archive in Cardiff, it is clear that many of those Welsh labor migrants were indeed brave and ambitious, leaving behind a prosperous city named, eventually, Donetsk. Absolutely fascinating little bit here. I've got a couple of articles just because I found them real fast. Understand this is just a quick search. I'm going to drop a couple of them here in the comments here. Even got this one from the BBC. Talks about John Hughes himself. Really just fascinating stuff right off the bat. So thank you, Ozzy. That was amazing and love it. Absolutely love it. Glad to have it. Also glad to see Jerry, Lucille, and Luciano all here, and Al as well. The crew is all ready to rock and roll. And let me say, I am excited as all get out for it. We've got a lot of stuff going on in Ukraine. So let's go ahead and just dive right into it. First thing we've got is a mea culpa, not from me, but from Crimean Wind, one of the sources I regularly use. And let me tell you, this is the type of thing I want to see from sources that I use reliably. Specifically, that they were taken in by fake information, and they want to make sure you know that that information was inaccurate, and they're saying sorry effectively. Yesterday, they say, we were bombarded with messages about fake events via the bot. For example, the alleged hacking of FM radio in some cities of Crimea and the broadcast of Ukrainian songs. Unfortunately, we bought into this. And by the way, there's multiple reasons for that. For one thing, it's been a regular feature almost in Crimea on a regular basis. After checking later through trusted people, we found out that there was no hacking. Then messages began to arrive about the alleged hacking of television broadcasting. Also fake. We checked. And various other sonorous supposed events timed to Russia Day, about tricolor ribbons in the trash can, for example. Of course, these are all informational special operations, but they do more harm than good. Moreover, from those that are invented by not the smartest manipulators. Such news is happily picked up by the media of mainland Ukraine, showing a small victory on the information front, but Crimeans sit there and go, wait a second, that didn't happen. And if it didn't happen, how much didn't they trust Ukrainian media? So they are saying that they are in favor of telling what is happening truthfully, and the lie very quickly becomes obvious. So that is a mea culpa on the part of Crimean Wind, talking about this on the same vein the Institute for the Study of War, says that the Kremlin continues efforts to codify legal instruments and repressive measures intended to broadly censor foreigners and foreign organizations in Russia. That's right, they don't want an open information space. While we can see that, for instance, sources like Crimean Wind have seen the disinformation happen to them and then reported on it honestly, The Russians don't want you to know when you're getting disinformation from them. Absolutely not. So they got to censor foreign information sources and foreign organizations to keep that from coming out. In this same vein, there was news 6-ish months ago about a Russian mill blogger channel that was opening a media school, and I think it was Serbia, as I recall. Well, they're opening a second one in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, likely to support Kremlin efforts to expand its influence in the informational space on the international front, especially in Central Asia. And then on top of that, we've got a Danish authorities arresting a Danish-Russian dual citizen who has connections to Russian intelligence services, which is likely part of this intense hybrid campaign, both informational and kinetic, against Western countries. So this is the media environment in which we find ourselves, one in which even the good news has to be sorted carefully to make sure that we're not getting duped by those who are bad actors. Then there was this from Doug Lyman, who is a American film producer and director, who tells this story. Let's see, audio is on. Let's go ahead and hit the play button.
Ukraine's not going to stop till they win. I mean, I met, coming back from the front 2 years ago, I was with a GRU, a squad from the GRU, and one of the commanders wanted to stop and check in on his mother-in-law, and she was in a small town, a few hours east of here. She shows me in her woodshed that she's got 2 cases of Molotov cocktails. And this woman's a grandmother. And I'm sort of asking, like, I think they look like Molotov. I'm like, what are those? I'm gesturing, and she sort of gestures back to me. The Russians come down her street. She's throwing these Molotov cocktails at them. And I thought, Russia's got no chance if Grandma's got 2 cases of Molotov cocktails in her woodshed. Ukraine's not going to.
Thank you for the heads up. I got to get in a better habit on that. So that's the spirit of Ukrainians right there. That is how passionate they are about freedom from Russia. They're little grandmas, little babushkas, and they're pulling out the Molotov cocktails and light those things on fire and throw them at the Russians if they come down her street. Will she really? I don't know, but that's the spirit that the Ukrainians are putting out there. Then there was some interesting information about NATO, starting with former Russian chess grand champion, Garry Kasparov. And he made several points here, and he's speaking in, I believe, Russian, so I'm not going to play his video for you. But Anton Herashchenko puts forward these points. NATO was created for one purpose, to protect free Europe from Russian aggression. Today, Ukraine is the only country fighting for the main purpose for which NATO was created. Ukraine is already a member of NATO. It has shed so much blood to fulfill NATO's purpose. China's position is quite clear. It needs the war to continue indefinitely because it weakens both Russia, as China has it in for it, and the West. It needs a situation in which Xi Jinping will control the process and choose the right moment to attack Taiwan. Russia needs to realize that they have to build the country differently, and that the choice is to be a Chinese province of raw materials or to return to Europe on other terms. And doggone it if I haven't said all of these things in the last year. And I'm not going to claim to be the author of these words from Garry Kasparov in that regard, but truly, if I was Vladimir Putin, I would be more concerned about China than any of the Western nations. You see, China's got the position. They've got the manpower. What they don't have is the confidence. but they're getting there. So right now, Russia's got two potential futures here: to be a gas station and resource point for a burgeoning Chinese economy and thus become basically nothing more than a vassal state to China, or they can rework themselves to work with the West again. They almost, honest to goodness, they almost had that situation set up in the right before this whole thing kicked off. They had Europe really almost addicted to Russian gas, so they could have done so much more, and yet their desire for power, and their desire for land, overcame the patience to wait it out. Hi, Robbie. Glad to have you here. In fact, Ozzy says here, the moment I realized this was not going to be a rerun of 2014 was when the babushka gave a Russian soldier sunflower seed, saying they will sprout from his corpse. Wow, I wonder where she is now. Yeah, that'd be interesting to find out. And Lucille says, amazing what grandmas can do. But Ukraine is fighting NATO's fight. They're fighting the fight that NATO was designed to fight. On the other end of this is Romania, Poland, and Latvia, who are deeply concerned about Russia's hybrid operations in NATO countries. That includes disinformation campaigns, sabotage, additional things. We talked about sabotage the last video, so that's going on. They've got them working on hybrid information warfare operations, spray painting the coffins on French monuments and things like that. Russia is all in. They know they can't truly go directly through a kinetic war with NATO, at least as they are right now. But that isn't stopping them from weakening NATO and the West in every way possible. As the statement from these countries says, Russia is and will remain the most significant and direct threat to Allied security. We will work in a comprehensive strategy to contest, constrain, and counter Russia, including by limiting Russia's capacity to reconstitute its military and its ability to pose those threats. Then there was another little bit of information here. You might be familiar with Argentina's Javier Milei. He's the populist leader that managed to come into the election in almost surprisingly out of nowhere to take control of the country, and he immediately began enacting relatively conservative and financially responsible reforms in the country. But he's also directly expressed support for Ukraine, which makes him rather unlike some similar media figures or political figures in other Western countries. And he has busted out the Super Etendard combat aircraft that were purchased back in 2017. Now, they were immediately under British embargo because these could carry the Exocet anti-ship missiles, and therefore they really never got off the ground for Argentina. They're trading them in, I guess you might say, and sending them to Ukraine in exchange for drones and helicopter type equipment. So they're switching it up. Now, these are old airframes, or the design is from 1978, but these were pulled out of service right before they were sent to Argentina and were relatively modernized with the latest equipment as of 2017. Now, my understanding is that these 5 aircraft, that's all there are, 5 aircraft, will be sent to France for modernization, made capable of carrying Scalp EGs and Storm Shadow missiles, as well as other modifications, and then passed on to Ukraine and may beat F-16s there potentially. 5 aircraft, that's not big. But it's 5 aircraft that Ukraine didn't have before. And they could potentially have uses as drones or as using them similar to their legacy Russian hardware. A lot of opportunities here, just a small number. That said, my recollection is that France also has a bunch of these in storage. Maybe not huge amounts, but just saying. This some additional information on this. The reason that the Brits were putting an embargo on Argentina's use of these was because of the Falklands War back in the 80s. That's when I believe that's when an Exocet missile was launched at one of their ships and did tremendous damage. The British ships, that is. So that's what this was a long. This is a long game here, is what it is. But with Javier Milei in power now, there's a new possibility for them being brought into the fold. So there's a lot of interesting things going on. They do point out that they've been largely idle for that time. And as Igor Sushko says, it's noteworthy that these modernized French jets are essentially brand new and will come with huge spare parts packages, including 8 engines and flight simulator training. So, hey, you know what? Argentina, good on you. Let's see if that means that we're going to be working with Argentina a lot more in the future. Now, one of the problems we've seen in this war, especially as it's being fought without either side truly gaining air superiority, is that after 2 years of war, there were some early offensive operations that really worked, but now they've all adapted. Luciano, thank you very much. Yes, that's your country. All the hearts to you on that one. Absolutely. Thank you. So tell Javier Milei that we appreciate those a lot. So after 2 years of war, when they had the early successes with offensives, you've noticed that no major offensives have really been successful since. Of course, some of that is the fact that neither side has air superiority, but it's a difficult environment to conduct offensive operations. Defense is now the stronger form of war. And as Ukraine remains on a relatively defensive position, the Russians have been destroying themselves, beating themselves against Ukrainian positions, and experiencing the attrition that is attendant to that change. Mr. Ryan here has got a longish thread on it. So I'm going to go ahead and just post it here for you guys to look at if you would like to check it out. From the analysis from the Kyiv Post, though, Ukraine's drone wars will impact future designs of armored vehicles. As General Omar Bradley said, we should not fight new wars with old weapons. And what we're seeing is that many of the old weapons aren't surviving well on the battlefield, but newer or more appropriate designs are doing tremendous amounts of work there. Things like Bradleys and CV90s and other light weapons and equipment, light vehicles that are able to move in quickly, deliver devastating blows to expensive pieces of hardware that are irreplaceable for the enemy, evacuate soldiers, which are far more important, and get out, or even if hit, will keep the crew alive. So a lot of this is this is what the future of warfare is. Would the U.S. today fight a war like Ukraine does now? Probably not. Probably we would go in there and try to air superiority everything, and then have to dig in and learn the tactics of the day in order to come up with a better way to fight. But that's exactly what we did in World War I. That's exactly what we did in World War II. And so if this really does end up with the U.S. directly involved, which I do not hope, I genuinely hope does not happen. Genuinely. But if it does, I imagine that's what's going to happen, is we're going to have to relearn the lessons that everybody else has already learned. Now, let's go and turn over to the information of coming out of Cuba. That is that 4 Russian vessels have docked in Cuba. The lead ship that arrived was the Nikolai Chaiker, which is a rescue tug. And that's right, they'll be they brought their own tow truck just in case one of their warships managed to break down on the way. Still, they managed to get all 4, as I understand, all the way there. And this includes a frigate, the Admiral Gorshkov, which has arrived in Havana Harbor. They did a few exercises on the way down, and they put out a slickly produced video on it and all that kind of thing. But overall, the fact that they're pulling into Cuba, well, I think this picture says it all. This is a nuclear-powered Russian submarine floating into the bay as a man parks his classic car right in front of it. It just kind of says it all right there. Here's that ship arriving into port, coming in at a slow pace. Obviously, in this situation, they did do the whole 21 gun salute thing and all that kind of stuff. Even busted out some ancient cannons in a nearby fort to do the counter signal. So just they're doing a bunch of pomp and circumstance over there in Cuba for this. But overall, the U.S. is not just sitting idly by. They've got the destroyers Truxtun, Donald Cook, and Delbert D. Black, as well as a cutter, Stone, and a Poseidon tracking this Russian naval flotilla. They did sail less than 30 miles off of South Florida's coast, but obviously they were well monitored the entire time. And I'm betting that the U.S. signals intelligence guys are having a field day finding out what all they can do with that. And this is just what they knew about. I made the joke that we should send like a Coast Guard cutter to follow it and make contact, but apparently they were ahead of me on that. Then we've come to some interesting new news on sanctions. The U.S. has widened their sanctions against Russia specifically to target semiconductor flow, but there are a lot of other aspects to this new package of sanctions. This is including that the Russian financial infrastructure, including the Moscow exchange. And now the Russians have announced that the Moscow exchange can no longer deal in US dollars or euros for their foreign currencies, precious metals, stock, or money and futures. So this really restricts Russia's ability to work in foreign currencies, is what it really comes down to. On top of that, Gazprom, which used to be Russia's crown jewel, now has literally had an arbitration court in Germany say that they can terminate their long-term contract with Gazprom that was worth 13 billion euros, that they can now charge Russia for their failed gas deliveries. So it's not good news overall, and also means that Gazprom is losing money. And with Putin sending messages that he wants to freeze the conflict yet again, this whole thing is getting even crazier from a financial perspective. Here's additional information on the Moscow Stock Exchange. You can see that they were trading generally, and then all of a sudden, boom, right into the floor. The decision could affect equipment supplies, manufacturing, education, and scientific projects, all of which depend on foreign currencies. It is expected that the dollar exchange rate will be determined through over-the-counter transactions via banks rather than on the stock exchange as usual, reminiscent of the situation in the 1990s. Russian Telegram then reported that long lines began to form in the currency exchange points in Russia, and the Russians want to buy the dollar while it's cheaper, as many of them are convinced that the exchange rate will be worse tomorrow. The sanctions package targeted 300 entities, including a few surprises as we go through, with the goal of degrading Russia's capability to pursue its war of aggression against Ukraine. Russian companies related to, they got residents of Russia, China, Belarus. By the way, China, pay attention to that. Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, UAE, and other countries, including companies related to the extraction and sale of energy resources, Russian companies involved in the military-industrial base, Russian financial institution, Chinese entities, which continue to sell key dual-use goods to Russia, Belarusian entities and associated individuals supporting the Russia's military efforts, and Russian individuals involved in the forced transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children. So this is a really significant package here. Now, the Russians are now currently saying that their banks will buy US dollars for 50 rubles per dollar, but they're selling them back for 200 rubles per dollar. So they know which way this is going to go. Now, from Igor Sushko, today's U.S. Treasury sanctions against Russia's financial infrastructure directly threaten China with secondary sanctions. Russia's newly opened VTB bank branches in China have been the loophole that Chinese exporters have used for transactions from Russian buyers. So they're now getting China in on the sanctions game, obviously by sanctioning Chinese companies and individuals that are continuing to do business in the financial and weapons sectors with Russia. It's getting really spicy out there. However, just because there are sanctions does not mean that all things are living, shall we say, in an austere state. Putin's family continues to live luxuriously, bypassing sanctions, including things like buying this yacht. A nice little sailing yacht right there. And this was sold to, despite the ban on sales of yachts to Russia, a company associated with Putin's nephew recently purchased this luxury French sailboat it says it right here, don't need the details there. It was sold to Burevestnik Group, which was acting as an intermediary that was brought through Turkey. And they then eventually sold to an importer in Russia and ended up being another one of Vladimir Putin's little boats. So there are enormous sanctions coming. And it's just getting even more crazy as we go on. Looking at the comments real fast here. Ozzy says the gas that goes to Austria, Hungary, and Serbia from Russia via Ukraine has its lease end next year. They will not be renewing it. Absolutely correct, and that's going to be entertaining when they do. And Paul states the Moscow exchange is too... Oh, dang it. One of these days I'm going to figure out how to get the words that are behind the little... Something to be thin. Thank you very much. Sorry, I've got a little icon right over the top of that word right there. Too thin to be a functioning market. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yes, let me just move this over here. I'll try and mess with that later. I really got to fix that up. So, yes, absolutely. They don't have a robust economy. Right now, the only thing that's holding them up is government spending, mostly on the war. And unfortunately, if that's the way you support your economy, you won't have an economy for very long. Now let's move to the news out of Ukraine itself. I had a whole bunch of little things right off the start. Now let's go ahead and move forward with Ukraine. Zelensky stated that this war will end on our terms. We will not pass this war to the next generation. We will end it. We will end it in the interest of Ukraine and the interest of Europe as a whole. Interesting, but not relevant for today. But the Kakhovka Dam, you'll remember that it was destroyed last year. And I mentioned a few times I thought it would green up because I've seen similar things happen in the past. And sure enough, we're seeing this place green up with saplings as much as 5 meters or about 17 feet tall, and with plants all over the place and the possibility for deer and boar that could roam in the area within a few years. The Kakhovka Reservoir is recovering from this natural disaster here. They may eventually rebuild the Kakhovka Dam because it was a vital hydroelectric power plant. But until then, this will be a biodiverse area right there in the southern part of Ukraine. Now, not everything is going wonderful, of course. This is the result of a missile strike on Kryvyi Rih, with the number of people having been raised to 8 and 21 injured, with a few more still missing. So that's one missile strike that impacted. Another one struck Konstantinivka in Donetsk region, injuring 5 civilians. This is a Russian aerial bomb in this case, with 13 apartment buildings damaged. And according to Kharkiv Mayor Igor Terekhov, Russia has destroyed the entire energy generation in Kharkiv, so they're now entirely reliant on external power source. The city needs some assistance, he says, from financial partners and international organizations to ensure heating, electricity, and water supply in the coming winter. Yes, in time it will return to a dry steppe. Over time, though, immediately it's certainly greened up for now. President Zelensky reported that Russian missile and drone strikes have destroyed 9 gigawatts of Ukrainian energy capacities. And he released the statement stating, and this is not yet the limit of Putin's terror. We must draw a line and start energy recovery. We must do everything possible and impossible to preserve the existing generation and restore the lost as much as possible. Rough situation for Ukraine's power infrastructure. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense has announced a new branch of the military, the Unmanned Systems Forces, drone forces, effectively. So now they're getting their own full-on branch of the military. Really interesting that they're expanding in this way. But look at how vital that those drones have been. It's a major part of warfare now. Rescuers in the Kyiv region are putting out a fire. This was as of earlier today, caused by falling debris during an enemy attack, according to the state emergency services. A private house, a gas station, and a garage were damaged. In another location, a warehouse caught fire. Now, usually when they blur out the background like this, it usually indicates that maybe some piece of vital infrastructure was potentially impacted, but I don't know that for sure. So it's they may have struck something a little more important than normal this time, not just houses and gas stations and garages. On the other side, we've got a bunch of thunderstorms rolling through Kyiv as of earlier today, actually yesterday, and they're expecting the rain to stick around through the 16th. The downpour has been so, quote, anomalous that the heavy rains look like this. Let's get this pulled up here. You see people driving through deep waters, and I think that one on the back is driving on the sidewalk. Now, in Las Vegas, where I grew up, I once drove through some flash-flooded roads, and it's very similar to this. So it might be a similar situation over in Kyiv, just a tremendous amount of water coming down in rain. Now, just in case you think that Ukraine's not doing enough to finance their own war here, Ukraine plans to sell state assets to help finance military operations, according to the New York Times. The government plans to auction off around 20 state-owned companies, including the Hotel Ukraine, a shopping center in Kyiv, as well as mining and chemical enterprises. They're drumming up the money in any way they can to stay in the fight for as long as possible. And these are the types of things, mining and chemical enterprises, that you would not sell without real need to do so. Still, it means that they're digging deep to stay in the fight and keep it going. So Ukraine is not just letting everybody else finance the combat there. A poll was done in Ukraine. Now, obviously, the situation of doing polling in a war zone is difficult. However, the results of the poll state that 73% of Ukrainians believe the country will eventually liberate all of its territories. 56% are confident that Kyiv will regain some or all of its territory within the next year, and only 5% believe that Russia is winning the war. Older people tend to be more positive than younger Ukrainians at almost all indicators, and 60% of the people in the group believe Ukraine should not negotiate peace with Russia. 54% believe the country is winning the war. So just some interesting insights there. You have to take these types of numbers with a grain of salt, but just interesting to see it through. Paul says that all the people I know get blackout cards telling them when they will have no power so the country can conserve it. Oh, very nice. At least they can plan for their situation and be able to take care of it. That's good news. It actually means that they have better control of the situation than other people tend to say. So the Ukrainian embassy has confirmed that the U.S. is no longer restricting access to Western weapons for the very controversial Azov battalion. Now, this is after a series of inspections required by U.S. law and a bunch of other changes. A lot of things going on there. Just for a quick 10-cent history here, the Azov Battalion, when the war started, was basically a ragtag bunch of ragtag militia, like a citizen militia. And as things really kicked off, especially over at Azovstal in particular, they formed up into a tremendously effective fighting force, at which time Ukraine nationalized them, which also means that they sent a bunch of other people along to join with this group overall, and are able to, and therefore, instead of being a whole bunch of Nazi militia people, it's basically a regular unit. It's just got regular Ukrainians in it. Now, Azov has a long history. It was formed by a particularly passionate individual when it comes to Ukraine being a separate state during the period of World War II. And they believed that Russia was the bigger long-term threat, so they figured we might as well have the Nazis train up an initial Ukrainian military and equip it for us, so that when all this is said and done, we'll be able to fight against the Russians eventually. Now, 80 years later, they're fulfilling their original purpose, fighting against Russians in favor of an independent Ukrainian state. So now that is all kind of a quick summary, and a lot of aspects there. Ozzy added some additional information. But yes, they don't understand a lot of what's going on there. And now that that's all resolved, they've got their inspections done. They've got the clean bill of health. Now they're giving them Western arms instead of making them suffer with Russia junk. Rheinmetall opened a maintenance and repair center in Ukraine, with Marder infantry fighting vehicles already being maintenanced and overhauled at the hub. And they expect that Leopard 1 and 2 main battle tanks and other German-made systems will also be repaired in Ukraine. That's a much shorter logistics chain than having to ship it all back to Germany for repair. So awesome. Let's go ahead and move over to Russia. The news out of Russia. Russia tests first-person view remote-controlled tank. This is a T-72 AMT that was converted to be driven remotely, but it was captured from the Ukrainians, and they couldn't figure out why you'd want to do this. I can think of a lot of reasons. Number one, the T-72 is the current reigning champion of the turret toss competition. So I don't know about you, but if I have my choice between being in a nice Western tank with blowout panels or a T-72 with a carousel autoloader that's right over my head, I know which one I'm picking. Russia lost more men in Bakhmut than in its Afghan war. Understand that the Afghan war was such a political boondoggle for Russia that it was nearly caused the fall. Well, in fact, I believe it did. It was actually instrumental in the fall of the country. So they actually did some little bit of research, looked it over, and 20,000 Wagner troops died during assaults on Bakhmut. That's just the deaths. So they're losing far more people in the war in Ukraine than nearly caused them to collapse during the Afghan war. So interesting. Oh, I managed to not interpret this. Okay. 3 servicemen died at a Nezogol Recreation Center in Belgorod region. This was a known military base and facility and was taken out by Ukrainian forces. So there we go. Even more effective work there. Okay, so backing up here, Ozzy says, let's see, back up to, actually, let's go all the way back to Paul there. Yeah, I imagine that the power cards there would kind of be annoying too. But at least they can plan for it, and that's a big difference. And Robbie says, that's correct. They are getting text messages and telegram notifications. Ozzy says, Azov were formed by soccer fans from Bryansk and were all Russian speakers. Ukraine's army had been neglected, so they took up arms. Exactly. Paul says, Azov are badasses that the media characterized poorly because they did not understand it. Yes, absolutely. They did suffer as POWs to the extreme measures. And Ozzy says he never thought any of the Azov defenders would be freed. I hope they still get held out to be heroes. So really good. You guys, I just got to say, I love your comments. They are wonderful, 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 wonderful. So keep doing them. More comments. Love them. 5 fuel tanks near the port of Ust-Luga in the Leningrad region of Russia derailed due to an apparent act of sabotage. It appears that the partisan movement against Russia is really picking up steam here. We're seeing more train derailments, more infrastructure on fire, more everything. So it looks like the Russians might be having a tougher time than they would like to let on. 22 Sri Lankans have deserted the Russian army and returned home, according to the Sri Lankan defense minister. They are promised regular jobs, high salaries, and benefits in Russia, including Russian citizenship, but the job turned out to be fighting on the front lines in Ukraine. So this is what Russia's doing. They're using false pretenses to lure people in. They then use false accusations to make those people fight in Ukraine. And then when they get the chance, they bail out and run home because it's not their war. Why would they fight it? Especially for the pittance, that the Russians are paying. Now, I mentioned the other day that it looked like, at least we had some unofficial news, that air defense crews and air defense systems were being rotated out of Crimea and up to Belgorod. Now, Karol Budanov says that Russia is going to place their S-500 Prometheus air defense system in occupied Crimea. This is, in principle, he says, an experimental application. So this would indicate Russia's hoping. They're hoping that their latest and greatest experimental something or other can stop those ATACMS missiles, can stop those Ukrainian drones. And they may discover that it doesn't work that way for them. He also said that the Kerch Bridge is being used by Russia mainly for personnel transportation. They use the ferry system to bring any heavy equipment and fuel and other heavy stuff along because the main railroad bridge has been weakened by the previous attacks, so it's not able to take its full load anymore. A partisan movement here. They have destroyed a military satellite communication station located on the 584th Guards Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment in Klin, Moscow region. So they've even provided pictures of the destruction of the vehicle, the location, and everything else like that. This is the partisan movement that is effectively working in Russia to try and stop the Russians from continuing their attacks. But Russian air defenses just aren't all that. Here's another Ukrainian drone that flew through the airspace in occupied Dagestan a few hours ago. At the time, no information on the target. And here's a tire manufacturing plant in Sverdlovsk region. So there's partisan action here. There's stuff, vital infrastructure, vital production facilities being destroyed. Now, the permanent military exhibition Patriot, known as Shoigu's brainchild project, has been raided by the FSB. The facility operators took in more than $2 million in bribes. That's dollars, not rubles, between 2020 and 2024. And this facility is near Rublivka, right outside Moscow. Corruption in the Russian military. I've mentioned it many times now that corruption in the Russian military will be what truly ends this war. because the more corruption there is, the less they are able to actually effectively deliver things to the battlefield. Ukraine has been kicking the corruption out. Russia has been embracing it. A Russian platoon commander was tied to a tree for 4 hours in occupied Kherson because he kept complaining about a lack of equipment to his leadership. So even the platoon commanders aren't exempt from this type of punishment. More partisan activity in Russia, this time in Goryach Kluch in the Krasnodar region. This is a gas station burning. Russian sources report a Su-34 crashed near flying from Morozovsk airfield to Mozdok airfield, with the pilot having the pilots having been killed in the crash. The Russians are basically saying it was a technical problem with the aircraft, and considering the location, I'd say that's likely. The Russian Institute of Plastics Technology is also on fire in Moscow. Lots of things on fire in Moscow. This is about the Su-34 that crashed. Already mentioned that. And of course, on the 10th, Ukraine shot down another Russian Su-25 jet. Now, around the time that Ukraine was shooting down a Su-25, the Russians claimed to have taken out a couple more Ukrainian aircraft on the ground. No evidence provided, but just be advised it's out there. And if I get evidence, I'll let you know. And that's the news out of Russia. Let's jump into the international front, where there's a bunch of things going on too. The Polish foreign minister says that there are 100 nuclear warheads in Kaliningrad Oblast. Kaliningrad is the teeny tiny Russian enclave inside the European Union. It's not connected directly to Russia in any way, as physically, that is. So the Russians managed to pull it off and have been holding it for a long time. And now the Poles are saying that there are nuclear warheads there already, right in the heart of Europe. Germany pledged yet another Patriot battery. This will be another one coming in, and Zelensky managed to make a visit to this one before it was transferred over. So had a nice little tour and took a look at it. The Ukrainians are already trained on how to use these things, so it's just a matter of getting the equipment moved over. The Netherlands is announcing that they're planning to provide their first F-16s to Ukraine this summer. Now, there have been a bunch of different reports about what's going on with F-16s, all the way out to end of the year. Pilots won't be ready. There's a bunch of things going on. The Russians already have their theories in play, saying they think that there will be Western pilots flying the F-16s initially. Kind of like what they did in Vietnam, I think it was, or Korea. I'm not sure which one. Where in fact, I think it was Korea, where the Russian pilots would be flying the aircraft on combat missions. So they're thinking that the Americans and the West are going to do much the same thing. Still, F-16s, soon. Trademark. Norway is allocating $257 million to bolster Ukraine's air defenses. This would be mostly to procure Patriot missiles for Ukraine. Now, this is the Slovak defense minister who's complaining that the MiG-29s that were sent by his predecessor amounted to treason. So the MiG-29 fighter jets that were transferred from Slovakia to Ukraine, he said, this is treason, and he's going to file a criminal complaint. Lithuania is busting 14 M113 armored personnel carriers to be sent to Ukraine specifically for demining efforts. So that'd be very useful for Ukraine, especially right now. Now, the Swiss peace summit, I should say, that's going to be coming up in a few days here. Originally, they were supposed to address the entire 10 points of President Zelensky's peace plan, but they've had to kind of slim down the agenda a bit to try, and they're hoping to get a consensus, a starting point. Then on top of that, Ukraine is actually hoping that Russia will attend the second conference after the first one has got a few starting points and they can start some real negotiations. in a better set of situations. Let's see. I'm going to pause for just a second here and read the comments. Luciano says, literally luring men to their deaths. That's about the bringing people like from Sri Lanka and other areas there. Yes, absolutely. Ozzy says there is a need for the foreign recruits who are POWs in Ukraine to be interviewed in their native languages and for those interviews to be shared back home as a warning. That's a great idea, Ozzy. Russian pilots flew in Korea, Vietnam, and Sinai. Okay, very good. I knew for sure on Korea, and I was pretty sure on Vietnam, but you got the history there. Paul says, we hosted Ukrainian pilots trained here in the USA last year. I think they're close to being ready. I think you are correct that they are. I think so. I think the first batch should be coming out this summer. But there's a bunch of complaints about that too. So I'll try and find out more information as I get the chance. This is about, I mentioned this one briefly earlier. A Russian woman was detained in Denmark. She is suspected of being in connection with Russian intelligence. She has had cash flows from Russian state funds. She is suspected of providing a foreign intelligence service with the ability to operate in Denmark and a bunch of other things here. So this is part of Russia's ongoing hybrid warfare model here. The $50 billion loan we talked about the other day looks like it's all a done deal, and they've got all the agreements finally inked. They'll be discussing this apparently on June 13th and 14th, so in the next 2 days to finalize the last little bit. Norway will contribute 240 million euros to air defense measures for Ukraine, and they also mentioned the Germany doing the 100 Patriot air defense missiles, and Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway all contributing to the initiative for more Patriot air defense missiles. By the way, I just want to state right here, this is an official Ukrainian account. I think it is wonderful that we see Ukraine saying thank you. Not just gimme, but thank you. It makes a big difference to me. The G7 letter stated that we need to step up our assistance to Ukraine to win this war, both for Ukraine's democratic European future and for our own security. To do that, we need to be prepared to take big, bold decisions proportionate to the historical significance of our times. And they called for confiscating all of the Russian assets that are currently frozen in Europe. This is a historic time, and it's historically significant. The parallels are there in history, and those who have eyes to see are able to discern the direction that will happen. So keep your eyes open. Estonia even is going to send a new package of Mistral short-range air defense systems. They've already received some Mistrals from France and Norway, so even more will be helpful to them. Germany is also going to start producing the Lynx armored fighting vehicles for Ukraine. They'll also be joining the CV-90 and Rosomak and Bradley as Ukraine's most modern armored fighting vehicles. But with production beginning this year, we could soon see more of these Lynx on the battlefield in short order. The United States is also offering another Patriot air defense system. So this will be the second one from the U.S., and 3 supplied from Germany, and the Netherlands also supplied one. They still need, by my count, around 7 or 8 more. But, there we go. From Russia's perspective for just a moment here, Armenia has officially pulled out of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. As NATO has grown bigger and stronger, the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization has fallen apart. And you know what's amazing? If you really look at it, 6, 8 years ago, it was NATO that was falling apart. But Russia managed to rejuvenate it. revitalize it, give them new purpose. And now NATO is stronger than ever. This is 4 minutes long, so I won't play it right now. I will just drop the link here. From Jens Stoltenberg with NATO, military support for Ukraine will become mandatory for all NATO members and will be centrally coordinated by the NATO command. This will be finalized at the NATO summit in Washington next month. Now, they did carve out an exemption for Hungary because Viktor Orban didn't want to be any part of supporting Ukraine. Interesting, and I suspect that this might have long-term ripple consequences. But either way, that's at least they're taking the wins they can get. And getting Viktor Orban to at least promise to not veto that aid is enormous. Let's go ahead and move on to the front-ish lines. I'm going to start that and say it that way. Specifically about Crimea. In just the last 24 hours, 2 more S-400 batteries and an S-300 battery, those are air defense systems, have been struck by ATACMS missiles in Belbek and Sevastopol on June 11th, with multiple radars destroyed and munitions cook-offs reported. A lot of big explosions in Crimea. This is in addition to the ones we reported last time. A lot of people are talking about this as preparation for the F-16s. They're preparing the ground so that the F-16 will have the ability to take almost air superiority, at least in local areas. So really interesting to see this operation continue on. We're seeing more and more reports of Russian air defense systems. And yes, they are not cheap, Luciano. They are like, you're right, about $700 million, especially if you can get all the components. But they're preparing the ground for the eventual arrival of the F-16. More explosions reported, likely the S-400 and S-300 systems we just talked about. But this also mentions there were additional explosions overnight on June 12th. I've not found reports on what blew up, well, a few hours ago now. Russia, though, still doesn't like that and therefore responded with missiles sent at Ukraine, in particular hitting Odessa at about 5 a.m. local time. So multiple cities were also struck by Russian missiles. Keep that in mind, that every time one of these exchanges happens, there's somebody else who's going to be out in an apartment or a house. Let's move on to the situation on the front lines. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the deep state map today. I wanted to point this out, though. This is Volchansk, and this is a minerals plant, aggregate plant. An aggregate plant right here that apparently the Russians have not been kicked out of. Still, overall, Volchansk, the Russians have been kicked out of most of it. Some of this information, especially from the deep state map, is older, but they did update with this clarification of this one position. Now, this may have changed since then. I don't know for sure, but I wanted you to know about it before I went on from there. Now let's kind of reverse things. I usually pick up the War Gonzo report, which is from the Russian perspective at the end. But this time, I'm going to quickly read through it for you, just to give you the feel for what we're expecting here. Zaporizhia front, positional battles near Robotyne and northwest of Verbova. No significant line of control changes. Donetsk, fighting continues on the approaches to Konstantinivka, Krasnodarivka. There's an advance of Russian troops. And the fighting on the outskirts of Karlivka, I believe is the correct pronunciation. Yasno-Brodovka, which is the Russian pronunciation, I'm pretty sure. There are battles on the outskirts of the village, but you notice the wording here, trying to improve their positions. There is one area where they show an advance, but most of these are basically saying the fighting continues in these areas with small advances taken. Chasiv Yar. The Russians continue their assault on the eastern suburbs of Chasiv Yar. There are tactical successes, meaning not really changes in the lines of control, but maybe gaining a fortified position or a building, most likely. Kharkiv. The Ukrainian armed forces are not abandoning attempts to counterattack in the area of the settlement of, I believe it's Hlybok in Ukrainian, and carrying out attack after attack. The Ukrainians have actually taken most of that settlement already. Fighting continues in the central part of Volchansk, which I just addressed on the deep state map. Northwest of Avdiivka, Russian forces made, quote, considerable gains towards both Sokil and inside Novoalexandriivka. The latter is considered mostly Russian occupied, while Ukraine continues to cling to an important trench network west of the town. So tough fighting in the east, and this is kind of the big concern for Ukraine right now. In the east, where Russians have not given up on things. Kharkiv region, they've reassessed their situation there. That's what I was talking about in Hlybok there, that Ukraine managed to push the Russians back directly north of Lipsy. Still working on that area, and clearly the Ukrainians have the advantage at the moment. Then there is this forest strip that the Russians took near Vlimivka, bypassing Vesely. There might be some particular resistance in this area, but either way, small gain in footprint there. Now we go to the defense intelligence update from the UK. Russian ground forces have likely achieved a limited break-in of the eastern suburb of Chasiv Yar, a town located approximately 8 kilometers to the west of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. They have also likely taken control of Ivanivska, a village southeast of Chasiv Yar. Heavy fighting is reported in the urban areas, with Ukrainian armed forces contesting RGF advances. Russian forces likely remain on the east side of a canal that runs through the city, which presents an obstacle to their advance. It is highly likely that the Russian ground forces are employing a dismounted infantry approach to clearing the suburbs, and that the Russian casualty rate is high. The Ukrainian armed forces report an artillery-centric assault on the city with thermobaric munitions in use. Chasiv Yar is likely of value to Russia due to its strategic position on a plateau, as well as its historic use as a logistics hub for the Ukrainian armed forces. Make no mistake, if the Russians take Chasiv Yar, it will not be the end of the war, but it will be a big blow to logistics in the region. Ukraine's army chief has reported on social media that intense enemy offensive actions are ongoing across nearly the entire front, with the primary focus being on Pokrovsk and Kurhova directions, where they have concentrated a significant number of assault units from 8 shock brigades. Despite continuous fierce battles, Ukrainian forces are holding their ground in Chasiv Yar, Klishivka, Kalinivka, Bilohorivka, where Russian troops' attempts have failed. In the Kharkiv and Zaporizhia directions, the enemy's efforts to advance have been unsuccessful. That's the Ukrainian report on the situation. I'm going to say it's a touch rosy, but not by much. Generally, I think I can trust this to be accurate. Russian mill bloggers are getting ready for the F-16. They're basically resigned to it. They talk about the F-16s already being prepared at a low start, and they say that all these statements about imminent transfer are the usual fog of war, meaning that the Russians believe the Ukrainians already have F-16s and are ready to start using them. And all this gassing about transferring those vehicles is just smokescreen for it. So they talk about it for a little bit here, and they're talking about the very things that Ukraine is doing to Russia right now in terms of it being the American offensive strategy, saying that the American offensive strategy is air power with the stage of overcoming air defenses due to precision strike missiles and ATACMS missiles. Then the F-16s and NATO aviation comes in, and then they conclude that basically the Ukrainians are fighting an American-directed war. Of course, it helps if you understand that the Ukrainians are being taught by the Americans. So they may be calling the shots, the Ukrainians, but they were taught how to do it by the Americans. So we're seeing them prepare the ground for F-16s and as close to the American way as they can by taking out the air defense systems and the other equipment that's associated in order to pave the way to make the maximum use of the introduction of the aircraft. That's the Russian perspective, just so we're clear. Just more commentary pointing out that the situation is getting more active in various areas of the front. And they're talking about Arizona here just one more time, mentioning that the Russians have managed to take quite a bit of this territory here. Going to be ongoing for a while. So we'll keep an eye on that and report as new information comes out. And that is the front lines. I'm about to jump into the extras. I've got some interesting stuff in here. Some of it related. No cat videos, but I got dog videos. Just be prepared for that. Let's go ahead and jump into it right away. And Luciano actually updates with the actual numbers. 500 million for an S-400 battery and reserve missiles. Export is 1 to 1.25 billion for a battery and reserve missiles. Prices may need updated. Interesting. Okay, so we'll start off with 6 suspected terrorists with ISIS ties arrested in a sting operation in New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. 6 natives of Tajikistan with Russian citizenship were detained in the U.S. on suspicion of connections with ISIS. Somebody else reports that 8 were actually detained with no citizenship specified. One of the detainees allegedly spoke on the phone about preparing a terrorist attack similar to the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. Now, Russian citizens, Tajik natives, Russia's behind this. They're at war with us. We better notice. These uniforms were recovered by Philippine authorities during a raid on an illegal offshore gambling facility. Now, if you look carefully, you can see PLA, or People's Liberation Army, printed on the buttons. Now, I don't know this, because I've not been able to find it elsewhere. Does the People's Liberation Army of China actually print that on their buttons? I know the U.S. does a lot of things like that and did during World War II and other eras as well. But do the Chinese put those characters on their buttons? If so, that is super suspicious. What's China doing with their uniforms right off the shore of the Philippines? Just saying. This video is about 2 minutes long. It has got the... I'm just going to play it for you. I think that'll do better if I do that. I will try to read the translation for you because it is... yeah, I'll work on it. Let's try this. My call sign is Chick. He gives his name. While no birds are around, we're hiding, resting. We're running God knows where. Tag number is, and then he gives his tag number. I'm appealing. Military unit in Ussurisk, 83rd Assault Brigade. I want to say we can do no more. 3 days without food, water. No support. I took responsibility of a commander. The commander is wounded. Butcher, how are you? Butcher? I can't. No energy. Really want to drink. Third one lagged behind, bled out. Call sign Farah, probably dead. More guys behind. I saw 5 wounded. 4 dead, all mutilated. No one's looking for them. What to do next? Don't know. Legs won't walk. And I want to live. We will surrender. Enough. Maybe we can live like that. We have no other choice. No ammo, nothing, and thirsty more than anything else. If someone sees it, don't even think about signing contracts. That's it. Something's buzzing again. I hope you're able to hear in the background his voice. This is a Russian soldier who's at his end. Exhausted beyond measure. He wants to surrender. The only reason he stopped recording right then is because, once again, the drones were flying. This article about how Viktor Orban wins elections is excellent, but way too long for me to actually read or summarize. I'm going to just paste it right here for you to read at your leisure. It talks about how he manages to keep winning, even when the situation is showing to be strongly against him. A lot of it is buying votes, is what it really comes down to. Right before the election, he promises big government programs, handouts, that type of thing, in order to drain the enemy, the other groups. And the rest of it is divide and conquer, keeping the opposition divided. So good read. It's an interesting article. Absolutely recommend you read it. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has posted this to mark today's Russia Day public holiday. The entirety of Ukraine is shown as Russian territory, just in case you didn't realize exactly how serious they are about continuing this operation until the end. A Russian FSB operative, Artem Kuryev, bribed European journalists to plant Russian disinformation as legitimate news. Remember hearing about the mythical Ukrainian separatists in 2014? That was completely made up and disseminated by idiots everywhere. The disinformation is thick. Russia is a master at it. They pay off their willing or unwilling stooges to pass it along. And so a separatist movement appears where none had existed, where instead Russian soldiers marched in their place. This woman managed to escape Russian occupation from the town of Oleshki across the ruins of the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson region. She waved her Ukrainian passport at the drone and was led to safety. Millions more Ukrainians remain under brutal occupation. I mean, look at this situation. She is walking across a destroyed bridge to get to freedom. This is the Ukrainian spirit at work. They've got their taste for freedom, and they know that no Russian totalitarianism will take its place. Border guards destroyed a Russian Zala reconnaissance drone by ramming it with their first-person view drone. So this is a fun little video here. Just going to quickly play it for you and turn off the music. You can see him bringing that FPV drone after the Russian Zala. And right there is where it clips the wing. And you can see the end result there in the field. In eastern Ukraine, a flock of sheep decided it was a little too sunshiny out, so they moved under a Ukrainian Army Aviation Mi-8 air helicopter to get out of the sun. Just makes me laugh when I see that. And we'll end off with this cute story right here. And I am going to
Выпущена
mute the audio here, let that play. A story of friendship between a border guard and Yasha the dog from the combat zone. He was asking for food all the time. He was dirty and weak. I couldn't pass him by. So now Yasha is here and accompanies me all over Ukraine. Now, wherever Andrei is, Yasha is always with him. At the front line, he tells him when to hide from enemy shells. And in the rear, he patrols the border areas with his owner. This is, once again, I am amazed at the love and care and heart that Ukrainians across the board give to their animals. He couldn't pass by this hungry and weak dog. And so he took him in, he fed him, and now he has a forever companion who's always with him everywhere he goes. And that's everything for today. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm glad that you are here. I always appreciate you guys being here. Love your comments. They were wonderful today. And I want you to know that every bit I appreciate all the hard work you guys do out there, both supporting Ukraine and in helping out in stopping that disinformation that's out there. It's a tough challenge sometimes because I've got some friends who are hardcore against Ukraine right now. And it's not easy conversations. So keep it up. Keep working on it. You got our support and you got my support. Absolutely. And on that note, you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.